Right, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. We're live streaming, so it's not just you in the audience, and when there's discussion and questions, we obviously have to get that out to people out there. Millions of folk all over the world, of course, with us now. And it's my pleasure to introduce Frans Rautenbach, an old friend of the Free Market Foundation. I think he's getting old in both senses of the word, old friend, but going back many years. And an advocate of markets and personal liberty for as much of his life as I'm aware of, which is a fair amount. He's an advocate and labour lawyer at the Cape Town Bar. Between 2001 and 2006, he consulted the governments of Uganda and Tanzania on labour law reform, licensing and business laws, and the economic cost-benefit analysis of legislative policy as a legislative policy tool, which in South Africa we now call a socio-economic impact assessment, or is better known perhaps as an economic impact assessment. So he's been an advisor on those to the governments of Uganda and Tanzania, both of which, if I may say, after he consulted to them, experienced high rates of economic growth, no doubt attributed to him. In 2012, he appeared as part of our Free Market Foundation legal team, which brought the very prominently published and followed labour law challenge to Section 32, or a particular word in Section 32 of the Labour Relations Act. And that resulted in a judgment for which I coined a new term. It's called an asculum defeat. Now, many of you know that what a Pyrrhic victory is, which is a victory where the cost of the victory is so high that you are effectively defeated. And Pyrrhus at the Battle of Asculum experienced a nominal victory, but in fact destroyed himself and his army. The opposite doesn't have a word, but it does now. We experienced that where nominally we lost the case, but the judgment was such that we got a lot more than we actually asked for. And this has resulted in quite an extraordinary change in labour relations, including effectively, which is not what we wanted, but effectively the destruction of much of the bargaining council system, and at least two of the bargaining councils, one of them more so than the other, are now effectively bankrupt as a result of trying to continue the way they operated before our judgment. And in a very big sector of the South African economy, this has impacted labour law substantially, and that is going to pass on to other sectors. Strangely enough, if we considered appealing against this asculum defeat, it would have been to say we didn't want things to be quite as severe as the judgment effectively produced. And Frans was part of that team, and a very formidable set of arguments were advanced, which will have profounding and lasting impacts on South African labour relations. His interest on the impact of labour law on unemployment and industrial unrest resulted in two books on labour deregulation or liberalisation. One is Set the Workers Free, the other is Liberating South African Labour from the Law, and his latest book is available for sale at the front there. And he has other publications, including Labour Litigation, In All Labour Profit, and Your Kruger Park Guide. This gets us to the culmination of his favourite thing in the world, which is spending time in the Kruger Park and writing books about how to be guided through it. I share that with him. It's one of my very favourite places, has lots of amazing childhood memories, and so he is a nature lover and a labour lover. He wants to see everyone having a job, and as the topic of his subject now to follow is he wants to see full employment with superior wages and superior working conditions, and he's going to tell us how his life's passion, second to the Kruger Park, which is labour, can be achieved and fulfilled. So this is, contrary to what many critics might think, a lover of labour and somebody who wants to see the best possible achievement of good working conditions, high wages, and full employment. So with that, over to our good friend Frans Rautenbach, who will take us through his formula for a happy ending in South African labour relations. Frans.
Leon, thank you so much. The road with the Free Market Foundation goes a long way. If you have a look in the introduction, you'll see or in the thanks, you'll see you and Francis are acknowledged for the two themes which are central to the book, to which I was introduced in somewhere the 80s, of free markets and deregulation. And thank you also for the opportunity with the Free Market Foundation case, which was a wonderful experience. I have received huge amounts of inspiration from the Free Market Foundation. There's also a separate chapter about industrial councils, which will briefly feature in today's mention as well. Finally, just to say that, Leon, the Kruger Park is the single socialist institution which I am in love with. To get to the book, just a little commercial. It's called South Africa Can Work, which prompted a colleague, Jean Meyering, at the bar to say he's so happy to see I'm finally turning my hand to fiction. All right, serious. Unemployment is serious. And here's the puzzle. I want to solve a puzzle today, which is the trade union saying to us every time we talk about unemployment and labor unrest, what about Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands? The problem is these countries have high levels of labor law regulation, and they have low unemployment, and they have labor peace. And if you look at the little chart, little table here, you'll see there they are. Unemployment between 4 and 6. Sweden is the worst. And union density is high. Bargaining coverage is on the high side. Labor market freedom is on the low side. So this surely looks like it defeats my argument. And I had to find an answer to this, because this is the big modern riddle with which the trade unions confront us. What about the Nordics, or the Scandinavian countries as they are called, plus Germany, plus Sweden, plus the Netherlands? All right, so I thought, let me look at 4 or 5 different factors, and these are general economic regulation. Secondly, labor law, specifically, my own bread and butter, for which the abandonment of which I argue every day of my life, despite the fact that I make my living that way. Trade union density and bargaining coverage. And then finally, as part of the bargaining coverage point, what is stated now in his economic policy indicators. There I see Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa's face. We must all sit around a national round table and sort out the economy, which had shivers going down my spine, and I will explain to you why. So what I call the economic codessa, or corporatism as it's sometimes called, where trade unions, government, and employees, represented normally by trade unions and employers' organizations, sit around a table and they sort out the economy, and in particular sort out the unemployment. Now, the first one then is general regulation, free markets. So let's look at this next one. Economic freedom and unemployment. The only thing I did here was a simple exercise of compiling the list from the economic freedom of the world and divided them into 4 quadrants: freest, second freest, third, and least free, and then looked at the unemployment. And as you see, the freest of about 6%, and so it goes up to 19% in the least free, and this is where we are. Of course, we have much more unemployment than 13%, but that is comparatively quite pathetic if you compare them to the free markets. So that's the first point, which is a simple one and a difficult one at the same time. Free the market generally, and that alone will get us back on the path of job creation. So that's the first point. Then I looked at a cousin of regulation, which is a very good marker or a proxy, and that is the amount of state money that is spent as part of the GDP. And I looked at consumption spending of our peer countries. We have, I've got a list of 24 countries, 12 above South Africa and 12 below, who earn more or less the same GDP per capita per annum. And I said, what do they spend from the state side as a portion of GDP, and compare that to the unemployment. And I promise you these are 24 selected only on the basis of GDP per capita. And there's the, to my mind, absolutely clear correlation. What I would like to point out is Namibia sitting there, the one country that has higher state spending, consumption spending than South Africa amongst this peer group, and lo and behold, has higher unemployment. They now sit on something like 32% for the narrow definition, whereas we're on only 27%. All right, so that's the one, and then here's the same thing in different format, quartile 1, 2, 3, and 4, state spending versus unemployment. There's the unemployment on the left-hand side, that axis, and state expenditure on the right-hand side. So again, the higher the state spending, the higher the unemployment. Simple as that. If you're a developing country like us, you're in for the high jump if you spend anything over 20% of your GDP as consumption spending. South Africa sits on, I think, 27% or something like that for consumption spending. Anyway, way above what we should be at, approximately 10 or 11%. That's consumption, it's not capital spending. All right, so second point is we have to reduce state spending. It's not difficult, but a friend of mine has a statement, has a saying, just take away the checkbook, everything else will sort itself out. All right, now let's get into the nitty-gritty of my business, labor law. Does labor law specifically influence the likelihood of unemployment in an economy? Now, I'm not losing sight of this other riddle which I've given to you, but I'm saying, and it's a difficult thing to say, but I say all other things being equal, does labor law regulation, the level of labor law regulation, influence the level of job creation? I don't think it's difficult to explain in principle. Most of you who have acquainted yourselves with the Free Market Foundation, the research and labor market and free market policy will know if you make something more expensive, people buy less of it. There's the old story about if you tax sugary drinks with the view that people will drink less of it, why do you think if you make wages more expensive, people will buy more labor? It is just insane. It's the same principle at work. Of course they know it. Now, what happened in approximately 1980 onwards was a very interesting thing. What we have here is a graph, and I think some people will argue about the exact calculation of the employment figures here, but the principle is clear. You can test it in other ways as well, and that is that in approximately 1980 and onwards, in that juncture there, economic activity, which is the blue line, carried on its merry way upwards, and all of a sudden, whereas for the last 30 or 40 or 50 years, the two had been in lockstep. In other words, there was a parallel developing process. For every bit of GDP created, so many jobs were created. And that relationship held. In 1980, when Mr. Vian came along with his new Labour Relations Act, that relationship parted ways, and we find that, as someone has called it, the jaws of the crocodile started eating us up. The GDP and the employment parted ways, and we have what is called jobless growth. So, in case you thought that we can just sort out the growth of the economy and thereby create jobs, this picture should tell you that is what we've been doing for the last 30 or 40 years. It has not worked. It has increased step by step by step relentlessly. The next myth that I think that should be slayed, very topical at the moment. If you ask anyone in the street, what is the greatest problem with our economy? They will tell you Zuma and corruption. Now, this is why that is not correct. The first number of columns are the years of Mr. Mandela's reign and his unemployment, or his nation's unemployment. Then we have Mr. Mbeki and his nation's years of unemployment from 94 to 98, I think he was 99, and the next 8 years, and then Zuma took over in 2009. Now the average of Zuma and Mbeki are almost identical, 25.4, both of them. So there is no story that Mr. Zuma is the problem that is causing unemployment in this country. The problem is that previous graph which I showed to you, which makes it absolutely clear that the problem started long before him. But if you want more rigorous evidence, I found a study that was done in India, because this is a huge puzzle. How do you show all other things being equal that labor law is bad and causes job growth to falter? What you can do is, if you can divide the country up into 40 or 50 little pockets of experimentation, and each one of those pockets of experimentation would have a distinct labor law, but otherwise the laws would be the same, the people would be the same, the people can move across the borders, and so on. So you have 50 states that you could compare, and that's what happened in India. In India, the federal or the central government sets most of the economic legislation. It's a centralized system, and the result is that you have a more or less contiguous set of people under a more or less similar federal or state legislation. Say for one thing, and that is in 1947, they made a law which said that each state can depart from the central legislation in terms of labor law. So they can either legislate in a pro-worker direction, or they can legislate in a pro-employer direction. And here's the conclusion reached by Messrs. Beasley and Burgess. What they say is, regulating in a pro-worker direction was associated with lower levels of investment, employment, productivity, and output in registered manufacturing. So on all counts, but for our purposes, most importantly, in respect of job creation, those states which regulated in a pro-worker direction in the net result suffered in terms of job creation, and those who regulated in a pro-employer direction. And how they did it was simply by allocating a naught if it was a neutral change, a 1 if it was pro-worker, and a -1 if it was pro-employer, or the other way around. They totted them all up, and this is the conclusion. And they said, after using standard statistical techniques, this is the conclusion to which they come. But let me rest my case not with India. I'll give you a US example, because they're also very useful. India, like the US have nominally a federal state. And one of the things is that in the United States, like in India, it's possible for the states, the individual states, to regulate upwards or downwards from the federal position in terms of economic laws and specifically in respect of labor. So what the Chamber of Commerce, the American Chamber of Commerce, did was a very interesting study in 2009. They designed a thing which is called the Employment Regulation Index. And it's simply 6 areas of labor law, which are employment relationship and costs of separation, minimum wage and living wage laws, unemployment insurance and workers' compensation, wage and hour policy, collective bargaining issues, which would include trade unions and so on, and the litigation enforcement climate, what we know as the CCMA or the Labour Court. 6 categories, and each of those got points allocated to them. And in the end, they again totaled the points on the basis that they made certain assumptions, if they're pro-worker, that they would be deleterious to job creation and vice versa. And then they divided them up into good, fair and poor. Good being those with the least regulation, fair being the middle ground, and poor being those with the most labor law legislation. And when it came to the overall ranks, 15 states were good, 20 fair and 15 poor. And what I did was to calculate the employment growth in each group. So I took the average employment growth of each state and just worked out the average in each group. The good group was 2.72, the fair group 0.6, and the poor group 0.49% per year. So there is no question. The good group, the least regulated group, outperformed the others by a country mile. Then I did another exercise. I added all the inhabitants of all the good groups together and looked at how many jobs were created in total in the good group and in the poor group. And the good group employment growth was 4.4%, and in the poor group it was a measly 0.6%. Let me give it to you in numbers. In the good states, they created 2.1 million jobs over the measured period, which was from 2009 to 2014, it's 5 years. 2 million jobs in the good states from about 47 million people. And in the poor states, only 390,000, starting from a much higher base of 62 million people. And then the bottom line. I will come back to the race to the bottom argument. But the most important point is that in the good states, the per capita income growth was 1.8%, and in the other two, it was 1.6%. So per capita growth is higher, more jobs are created. As I said in the beginning, let's regulate to create more jobs at higher wages. And lo and behold, despite the fact that we see that initially wages have to drop if you take down the protection of labor laws in order to absorb the low offer that the unskilled worker has to make. The only competitive edge that that unskilled worker has is to cut his wage. It's the only way he can get a job. Despite that fact, what then happens, the market is cleared and people rush into the market gets saturated, and we all know what then happens. The demand for labor goes up because there's a shortage. The moment that happens, the wages start rising. Now the employers look around and they say, oh, the wages are rising, what do we do now? The only way they can then stay in business is to start training their workers, start buying machines, upping the productivity, getting better output for less money or for the same amount of money. It's the only way, and that's how a country's economy grows. All right. Now let me get to the nice sensitive part. Who are here from trade unions? I didn't think they would. Just checking. The next point I want to make is about the impact of trade unions. And why I do that is it's so useful. As the doctors talk of a marker, when you want to examine somebody's blood or somebody's disease, you will normally have bodies in the blood that will be markers for a particular disease. Now, one of the markers for the impact of labor law is trade unions. If there is a density of trade union membership in any particular category, whether it's a company or an area or an industry or a country, what you will have is that will be a marker of the impact of labor law. Why? Because they focus on labor law. That's their job. That's why trade unions are a headache for employers, because they implement labor law. They run to the CCMA. They run to the labor court. They call the strikes. They insist on wage bargaining on a regular basis. They go to the bargaining council and use its mechanisms to enforce their rights. So I was interested to know what is the correlation between trade unions and job creation. I looked at specifically job growth, because that's what we need in this country. So here's a graph that runs from 1980, when the union business really seriously started, and the axes run in opposite directions. So that's nil for the unions, and that is 30 for the unions on the left-hand side. So unions maximally were 30, and then on the right-hand side you have -4, -3, that's in other words not a job growth but a decline in jobs, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 would be the highest in that period. And the period runs from, as I say, 1980 to 2004. Now the remarkable thing about these, and I was so surprised when this graph came out, because you don't know what's going to happen, is that the two run almost like two railway tracks in tandem. So that gave me pause for thought, because I thought, well, isn't it the job creation that is causing the union numbers to change? But what I should explain to you is that the union membership is expressed as a percentage of the total economically active population, which means that if people go in and out of jobs, the union density does not change. If they come in, maybe it goes up. If there's job creation, maybe the unionization goes up, but the correlation runs the other way. What we see here is that unionization goes up, job creation goes down. So what I'm saying to you is it's much rather the other way around. The unionization is causing a drop in the job creation. But I didn't rest with that. I then went further and found some studies. Here's Pennsylvania peer states. These are states around Pennsylvania, and for a certain period of time, 83 to 2000, somebody measured first on that axis the union density on the left-hand side, and you see there's huge variation. There's the famous New York, which we all know about, and then down here, for example, very low unionization, Virginia. And by now you will not be surprised to see that 60% job growth in Virginia with very low unionization, and vice versa in New York. Then I looked at a similar one, because it's really, it's almost too good to be true. You say to yourself, they're going to nail you about this. And I found out that it's almost universal. Here is a study on international developing countries. South Africa there, right top. Brazil, the famous Brazil, which has now got, I think, 12% unemployment. High, this is unemployment change, very, very bad, and in South Africa's case, and high union density change. So again, the same correlation holds. Next one, COSATU membership versus percentage of employment growth and decline. This is a short period. I only looked at first at 2001 to 2006 and looked at job growth again. And when you see mining, for example, there's mining, left top, very, very high unionization. Why? Because, as we all know, one of the inheritances of apartheid is the fact that we put them all in hostels and we put a fence around. So they have nowhere to go at night. They sit there and the unions come in, and that's the best entertainment they have for the night, is to sign up for NUM. For, again, Mr. Ramaphosa, who sits on the cover of that magazine over there. And the fruits are there for everyone to see. Minus 30 job creation in that period. And construction, which is the other extreme. I don't know if you still have it in Joburg, but it used to be like that. Construction teams stand on street corners. They don't belong to sites. They belong to themselves. They are free marketeers and they are independent contractors. They just put up their hand and the bucky comes around, and they work for big companies, but they pick them up and they work for the day. So job creation in construction is high, unionization very difficult, very low. Next one, trade union membership in a different period. Again, now I didn't only look at COSATU, but the whole unionization, same result. There's mining again at the top. Oops, that one mustn't go there. That's mining. Same there. And there's construction and there's finance. Finance, of course, one can understand. You don't have that much union activity. You do have, but it's very small. Then, if you look at the situations where there were changes, and here what I was interested in is trade union density and what is its impact on strike rates. You will remember that about 3-4 years ago we had a strike in the Western Cape, in the Durance, in the Hex River Valley, where the grape farmers, workers went on strike. As far as I can remember, that was the only big strike in South Africa not called by a trade union. But for that, trade unions call strikes. To prove that, here's New Zealand. Now, what you have here is the period of 1986 to 96. And in 91, a major change came with an act called the Employment Contracts Act, I think it was called. But one of the things it did was it made it considerably more difficult for trade unions to form memberships and to recruit people into their memberships. So, predictably, as a result of the act, trade union density dropped. There it sat in 91, and see how sharply it dropped. And predictably too, now I suggest to you, the strike rate dropped. And it is now almost negligible, and New Zealand has been going from strength to strength, as we know. Take Margaret Thatcher's changes. You will all have heard of the winter of discontent in the 80s, when she stared down the coal miners' union of Mr. Arthur Scargill, and she literally broke the power of the unions in in the UK. And before that, job creation in the 20 years before she came on board was a total in aggregate of 3.4% in 20 years. No wonder there was a winter of discontent. In the following 2 decades, after the inevitable depression, which occurred in the beginning of the 80s, it went up to 13.8%. And since then it has accelerated. The unemployment was relatively low in the UK for the last 30-40 years. An interesting study was done by the Heritage Foundation, very simple little study. They took 2 industries. They took the manufacturing industry in the United States, and divided them up into plants with unions and plants without unions. And they said, where were the jobs created? And here's the result. In manufacturing and non-unionized plants, job creation over the period from 77 to 2008, which gives you 30 years, 12.5 million to 13.3 million growth. In other words, a million growth. While in union plants, it declined from 7.5 million to 1.9 million. Almost wiped out because of unionization. Next one, in the construction industry, in non-union enterprises, jobs grew from 2.5 million to 6.4. In union, it declined from 1.5 to 1.2. Exactly the same result. Then in Australia, they said unions slow job growth. Mark Wooden and Anna Hawke investigated the whole world, and then they also looked at the figures in Australia. And they said 2.5 percentage points per annum less growth in lowly unionized workplaces. The important point which they pointed out was the private sector is subject to this rule. In the private sector, trade union density leads to low job growth, but not in the public sector. And the reason for that is fairly clear. The public sector does not have to worry about investors and clients and markets and costs. It can go on spending and appointing more people, as we have seen in South Africa. I'll come back to this topic, but trade unionization in the civil service in South Africa is 70%. The wage premium of the civil service is approximately 20% higher than the private sector. By all rules, if they had been a company, they would have been bankrupt, because 70% unionization would have been worse than any private company in this country has had to endure. And what has happened is from 2000 to 2014, 850,000 new people were appointed in the public service. Simple. If you need more teachers, you simply appoint them. The taxpayer will pay. So that bucks the trend, but it bucks the trend for a very simple reason, and that is they're not dependent on the workings of productivity, of savings, of markets, and so on. So what has happened, ominously, is that in this period, where you have 850,000 new jobs in government, the private sector has, to all intents and purposes, stood still. No job creation. So what has happened in effect is our bright and breezy, mostly black matriculants and graduates enter the jobs market. Where do they go knocking first? Where the best wages are in the government. So productive workers, potentially productive workers, are sucked out of the private sector and appointed in the public service, which is notoriously bad with productivity compared to the private sector. So public service jobs are slowly but steadily crowding out the private sector. You'll remember earlier I showed you the three presidents, Mandela, Mbeki, and Zuma, and you saw that the line went up, and Mbeki and Zuma were more or less the same, appallingly high figure of approximately 25% on average. The only reason I think why they managed to hold it sort of on the same level is because of all these appointments. But we'll come back to that. It's not going to work in the long run, and I'll give you reasons why. But in the meantime, although the percentage stayed more or less the same, the number of unemployed rose relentlessly. Earlier on, remember I showed you how state spending in our peer states killed off jobs. Namibia, with the highest consumption spending in this part of the the peerage, if you like, the peer group. Namibia, highest state spending, highest unemployment. Now it becomes clear, you cannot spend yourself out of unemployment. You can create as many state jobs as you like. In a developing country, those figures tell you that the unemployment will relentlessly march on. Okay. Now for the counter-arguments. All of this, to my mind, the argument should be over. And my preference is that American study. The American study on a comparative study of all the different states, which I told you about earlier. The good states created jobs a multiple removed from the average states and the poor states. And there's very little argument to counter that. Just to come back to the United States for a moment, there's a thing called the Taft-Hartley Act, which is the act about the right to work. Right to work means that the worker has a choice. He's not forced to join a trade union, whereas in the right not to work states, the worker has to fall in line with the trade union. So the Mackinac Center for Public Policy did a study because they wanted to see what is the worst and what is the best in terms of the results. And here are the outcomes. Comparing right-to-work states, in other words, compulsory, non-compulsory unionization versus non-right-to-work states. Right-to-work states showed a 40.26% gain in total employment, whereas the non-right-to-work states showed gains of only 18.8% in a 20 years period. So double, more than double, the number of jobs created, the percentage of jobs created in the right-to-work states. Now, those states where you are not forced to join a trade union, not surprisingly, has a very low unionization rate. They about 8%, whereas in the non-right-to-work states, it's 15%. So 8% unionization versus 15% unionization, the 8% creates double the number of jobs. According to the US Census Bureau, population increased in right-to-work states by 39% and only 16% in non-right-to-work states. So people move. People go where the jobs are. People go where the non-union companies are. That's where they know they will find jobs. According to the US Census Bureau, 4.9 million people moved from non-right-to-work states to right-to-work states from 2000 to 2009. 4.9 million across the borders. And again, as always, the clincher. Nominal personal income grew by 209% in the low union states, whereas it was 148% in union states. If I abbreviate if I say union states, you know what I mean. So the income is higher and the jobs are higher. So again, coming back to the title of the talk, not only do we regulate in that way, or non-regulate if you like, for higher jobs, but also at better wages. All right, so to come back then to deregulation will lead to a race to the bottom. Already that statistic says to you, remember the trade unions are the ones who enforce the labor laws. They have in the low trade union states, you have high job growth and you have higher wages. So that already defeats the argument as far as I'm concerned, to say that deregulation will lead to a race to the bottom. But anyway, let's look at some others, and that's Hong Kong, Papua New Guinea, Rwanda, and Uganda, which Leon conveniently mentioned in the beginning. There's their labor relations. Low levels, almost non-existent, 9.3, 8, 8.4, 8.9. Trust me, that's a very low level of labor regulation. And here are the results. Average unemployment over 10 years, 3.6, 2.4, 4.7, 3.6. And percentage per capita growth, 30, 58, Rwanda, 37. I think that's one of the most important reasons. Rwanda is not a model free market yet. It's working its way towards it. But they got the labor law thing right. They have almost no labor regulation. And they're creating jobs hands over fist. On the plane, I quickly looked up my favorite example of Brazil. Let me just give you a couple of dates and a couple of facts. You will remember that the trade unions used to say to us, go to Brazil. You must be like Brazil. They have high trade unions, high labor regulation, high state spending, and they have a paradise for the workers. Well, now, look where they are. Their unemployment peaked in March at 13.5%, after it was about 4 or 5% for a long period of time. In March 2017, it sat at 13.8%. Then the new interim government decided we have to make a change. And what they did was to announce a package of labor law reforms, because they said we have to do something about unemployment. And will you believe me, in the next month, the employers started factoring that announcement into their job creation steps, and they started employing people, and it now sits at 12. It's now for the period, and it's a short period, it sits at its lowest, and my prediction is it will go down further. Brazil, again, don't have everything right, but they do have right that they must do something serious about the labor law. Okay, the next one, just a further example of a race to the top. In Taiwan, this is one of the most magnificent examples because it runs over 60 years. And the most important two that you must look at is they have, by the way, very low levels of labor regulation. And there is the unemployment, 2.9, 1.6, 2.1, and so forth. Factory wage growth. Listen to this. Real growth in factory wages, 6.2, 8, 7.4, 5.6 per annum. Every year, not inflationary wages like our people get paid, real wages. To me, that defeats the argument of a race to the bottom. That, if anything, shows that it is the contrary, a race to the top. The next one, and I thank Leon for drawing this to my attention, is the simple argument that in economically free countries, if you look at the poorest 10%, the poor people in countries like the United States and Hong Kong and Singapore and Switzerland and New Zealand, that's what they earn. The poorest 10% earn $11,000 per annum. 150,000 rand per annum. The poor people, they have houses and TVs and cars, and the kids go to school. And this is a quarter, the most free quartile. So to me, that just destroys the argument. If you have a free market, people are going to get better income, even if they're the poorest people in the country. To come back to New Zealand that I mentioned earlier, the Employment Contracts Act, everybody was saying, or the left wing in New Zealand was saying, once you introduce this deregulatory regime where employers and employees can decide on their own employment contracts, you will have a race to the bottom. Well, here are the results. Between 1991 and 2004, it's about 15 years, unemployment fell from 11 to 4%. During the same period, labor force participation increased from 63 to 66%. So more people wanted to work. And thirdly, most importantly, real GDP per capita went from $12,000 to $25,000 in approximately 15 years. The per capita income doubled. It's impossible to have a race to the bottom in those circumstances. Okay, the next one they always throw at my head is, but what about inequality? You know what? Inequality is not bad. Ask Martin, he knows all about it. But it doesn't matter, because the truth is, here's Fiona Tregenna's measurement of inequality in South Africa within the workforce, within the working population and unemployment. On the left-hand side, you have unemployment, and you'll see in that period it went briefly up and then it came down. And in lockstep with that is inequality, the Gini coefficient. Think about it logically. If you have unemployed people at the bottom, that means logically, by definition, they earn nothing. So you're always going to have more inequality in a country like ours with high unemployment. It has to be so. It can't be otherwise. So that proves this one. The second one I find interesting, and I would like to engage in a debate on why. But even amongst the employed, the remarkable result that she came to was the same. So even within the workplace, the inequality is lower. I don't know how it works. I haven't figured it out. But these are hard figures. So there's no reason to doubt it. But all I'm saying is that argument is simply not correct. Okay, mandated minimum terms and conditions of employment. Let me rather say this. The one reason why I think free markets have more inequality, quite apart from the fact that they have more billionaires at the top, like Hong Kong and Singapore and Switzerland and the United States. The other reason why they have more inequality is because they have more immigrants. They have millions of people who move to those countries in search of jobs. You know what an immigrant is prepared to do? They're not spoilt. I have a Malawian gardener who works for me, and he says, I will work for anything. I know what it means to go hungry. So the immigrants in the United States, for example, you will find are prepared to accept lower wages, and they start on lower wages. The other truth is, of course, they move up faster than the citizens. Eventually, they are accommodated and associated into the economy, and they move up faster. But I think what happened in free markets is people forget that. Free markets are like a pantry where people can come and feed, except they do that for useful and productive work. And that's why, it's one reason why you have. So if you do have lower equality in free markets, I think that is the reason, or one of the reasons. Okay, the other one is they say to us that average welfare will go up if you increase the wages by way of minimum wages. That is a common belief. It is just not sensible. It's just not logical. People don't live off wages. Wages, you can't eat wages, you can't drive wages, you can't go to school on wages. You need the stuff. You need the books, you need the food, you need the cars. In other words, you need the wealth creation. Poor countries are poor because they don't produce wealth. Rich countries are rich because they produce more wealth more cheaply. So, by increasing the income for the same amount of work, you're simply not going to create more wealth. Of course, now what they say to us is, but if you improve the wages, there will be more productivity. Not if it's enforced. What then happens is employers find a rather devious number of ways to get out from under. A variety of mechanisms which include, they reduce the benefits of workers who are not covered by the imposed increases. In other words, the middle, the lost middle as they are called. They employ workers on shorter hours. They replace workers with technology and machines. They pass the costs on to the consumer. They close shop or they reduce profits. All of these are likely to lead to job cuts or partial reduction in working hours. But to those people who say to me that if you have less labour law, or more labour law, more regulation, more minimum wages, you're going to have more job creation because the productivity will go up. I simply ask to go to look at that study on the United States where we compared the highly regulated states with the lowly regulated states. If that argument held truth, then the highly regulated states would have been more productive, would have paid people more, and would have had more job creation. It is not so. It simply ain't so. And that is the short answer to that one. The other argument is, what about the Nordic countries? I've mentioned them very briefly. Why should we not follow the Nordic countries? Let me just say that, I'll finish in a few minutes. The Nordic countries, Sweden, Hong Kong, Finland, are in fact not highly regulated countries. They're not socialist countries. They're very free. They fall within the top quarter of free countries. And if you take out their state spending, this is where they rank. State spending is their single biggest sin in the free market lexicon. They stand at 4th, 7th, 8th, and 14th out of 159 countries. So the rest of their markets are extremely free. And if you measure it that way, by stripping out state spending, the state section, they are in fact freer than the United States, for example, and a number of other so-called free markets. What is more, they had drastic deregulation. Denmark from 6.38 to 7.767 and so forth over those years. It should also be noted that Sweden was in 1936 the wealthiest country in the world when it had very low state spending. In 1937, just listen to these, Canada's government spending was 25% of GDP, New Zealand was 24%, United Kingdom was 26.2%. In the same year, Norway's was 11.8% and Sweden 16.5%. So extremely low spending, but not the same, competitively low spending in those years. And it's only by 1960 that they caught up, that they were similar. And by then, they already had their health systems, their long life expectancy, and all those good things. So I'm sorry, that doesn't work. Finally, what about Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa's roundtable conference, the economic CODESA? Is that going to work? I simplified the data for a study which I did by way of this. And all you need to know is that you have 4 quadrants, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The first one is countries with highly centralized systems, which are normally those corporate systems where they sit at the government level and plan the economy, centralized systems. And then the other axis is homogeneous or diverse. So 1 is then centralized and homogeneous, 2 is decentralized and homogeneous, 3 is centralized and diverse, and 4 is decentralized and diverse. Here they sit, all those nice centralized countries, Germany, Norway, Sweden. The points that I allocated there, the lower the point, the better the labour relations. 73, that's now strike rate, simply a mathematical adding of strike rate, strikes plus unemployment. So this is pretty good. 73, that's their average. Very homogeneous and very centralized. Decentralized, little worse. Decentralized and homogeneous, but also very good. And this is where it gets interesting. centralized, diverse. So, in other words, countries with diverse populations. When I say diverse, it's mostly ethnically, but you also factor into that automatically cultural and linguistic, because they always go hand in hand. Look at that point. 283 compared to 73 and 71 and 99. So this is the worst place you can be. To have a diverse country like South Africa, like Brazil, like Belgium, like Spain, high levels of diversity and high levels of centralization. It simply doesn't work. What is true for the economy is also true for the labor market. And this is the best place to be. Singapore, Switzerland, Mexico, Czechoslovakia, US, highly diverse, but they solved it by decentralizing their labor market. In other words, work at plant level, negotiate individual contracts, and so forth. And don't sit around a government table at NEDLAC and think you can plan us out of trouble. So that's what I want to end on. What I want to say is there are 5 points that come from this. The first is centralized economic planning in a diverse country like South Africa is the kiss of death. Secondly, general market freedom is good for job creation, as we've seen. Low state spending is good for job creation. Labor market freedom is good for job creation. Trade unions are the kiss of death. They are not the friends of the workers. I think it's time that we say this to each other. And then finally, in a diverse society like ours, a centralized corporatist system is the beginning of the end. It's not going to work. I'm sorry if I am a bit despondent, but each of these points has a counterpoint. Take away the checkbook and take away the laws. The rest will fall in place. Thank you.
Take questions?
Absolutely. If we have time and if there are questions, I'll be happy to take.
Questions, comments? No?
Thanks, Leon. The level of engagement between the trade unions and the workers and the corporates, is that not the root cause of the evil? Is it as efficient as it could be and as constructive as it might be?
That is at the symptomatic level, I think. You have to go to the structural level underneath to find out why that happens. It happens because we have huge diversity of income, education, ethnic backgrounds, and so on, with different agendas. Let's take an unrelated example. I'm reading Professor Janssen's book on fees must fall at the moment. And he describes so well how people come from completely different backgrounds. The point is, if you have to solve a problem in a room, the size of this room, or even smaller, you just have fewer problems like that to contend with. It's been shown all over the world. If you can leave it to the parties themselves to sort out the problems and not give them big sticks like laws and strikes and unions and CCMAs and labor laws, labor courts to beat each other over the head with, but they simply have to get along because they need each other, then it will work. So I think smaller, more decentralized, those incentives will still be there. But you know what? Switzerland has sorted out huge diversity over the centuries. And so has a number of other countries. Hong Kong, you have immigrants in Hong Kong. Singapore, huge immigration. And not necessarily educated people. Malays and Chinese. You know that the Malays and the Chinese in Switzerland sorted out their disparities, the inequalities, without a single affirmative action law. So I think let them sit around the table and sort it out. They will do it. At plant level.
First of all, if I can So you're so right about Singapore. I've just come back from a short visit there. It is incredible to see how that little country has harnessed and managed diversity in such a positive way. It's unbelievable. I wanted to ask a question. I'm a technology lawyer and I know next to nothing about labour law. Are you suggesting that there should be no labour laws? Because my understanding is that the Labour Relations Act and take the Basic Conditions of Employment Act came into being because there was a recognition that the bargaining powers of employers and employees are not equal. The same reason why we have the Consumer Protection Act. If you go into Pick and Pay, you will have noticed that there aren't 6 or 7 negotiating rooms as you walk in. Take it or leave it. So you need to redress that. I'm just wondering, I mean, there must be some labour laws, and I'm just wondering what you see as the basic ones which should exist and the others which should be scrapped.
Yes, the most important labour law is a piece of law that we've had for a long time. It's called the law of contract. It's really an important piece of law. People should be able to conclude their contracts and that should be enforced. All these examples that I've mentioned to you, the ones with the race to the top, operated, if there were labour laws, they were minimal and they were not important. You didn't have the impact of trade unions, tiny trade union presence, tiny minimum wage effects, all of those things. So I personally don't see the point for any one of those laws. I really don't. And the figures show the countries, especially diverse countries, let's stick to the diverse countries, the Singapores, the Switzerlands, United States, the Czechoslovakia and so on. Those countries operated well with minimal. We will always have, but how little we should have we can debate. But in principle we should have as little as possible.
Even though I'm the MC, I have to do something somewhat unusual because I have to go and do a TV program now. So I'm going to close off, or Jane's volunteering to. Are you volunteering to take over from me? So I have to go, I'm afraid. But before I go, I am going to hand Frans a strange gift, thanking him for his talk, and then he can carry on with questions and discussion, and Jane will MC. And that is, he refers in his introduction to a book. He says, where is it now? I must thank some who probably do not know how important their influence has been. Firstly, Leon Lowe and Francis Kendall, authors of The Solution, who kindled his love of freedom. And so he acknowledges us in that book. So in return for that, what we're going to be doing is giving him a leather-bound edition of that book, which has a similar sort of
Never noticed.
That is the one, unlike maybe the one you read. It's autographed note, but it has a foreword by Winnie Mandela, which might surprise you. So have a look at it, and various other people like Clem.
Thank you very much.
So with that, thank you.
Much
and I have to
appreciated.
excuse myself.
Yes,
but I see
enjoy.
that there's an interesting proceeding without me. I'm going to go now appear as, since I'm a Gupta front, I'm ANN 7. So
You better talk quickly before it falls.
yes,
It will collapse any second.
And the book is available. And what's more, I just got some good news. If you buy 2, you can actually read it twice.
It takes about 7 times.
Think about that.
Are you therefore saying that gangsterism is better than having laws? Because in some of these societies where you've had issues, the only way to sort them out is through gangsterism.
Not in the successful societies that
The
have.
USA is a good example.
Which one?
The USA.
The USA has huge problems which are not the result of free markets. I can promise you. If you regulated the US more, and they are only a 3/4 way free market at the moment. They have huge centralization of government. There's government spending is going up all the time. Their law, a rule of law, is declining. So I'm hesitant to defend the US as pure free market. They have huge problems. So I barely think that the US is an example to follow. I come back to Singapore, or Switzerland. They are highly democratized societies, especially Switzerland. They sort out everything at neighborhood and canton level. They sit down and they make laws for their own municipality, for their own neighborhood, for their own region. People don't have time for gangsterism. They're far too busy working and making money. So I just don't believe that. The other thing is gangsterism in the labor market. South Africa is barely an example to follow. If you have the right to strike, that is an immediate incentive for having people standing outside the factory gate with a baseball bat. That's where the gangsterism comes in. Because it pays to keep those scabs out. Take the right to strike away, and the incentive to beat up the scabs goes.
Given the culture in the country at the moment, which in my experience, is that everybody wants to take away from the haves. They want more of what the haves have.
Yes.
What do you think the chance of success will be that we can sequestrate, if you like, this labor laws that is crippling us? What do you think the chance is going to be of getting that done?
It will be politically, no challenge could be bigger. I think we have to accept that. But what happened in China is, I think, the way we should go. And that is, Deng Xiaoping formed these free market zones. He called them special economic zones. And they are tiny little experimental zones where people can have a free market and a free labor market. And they started in Shanghai. And within a year or two, the nation, although they're not a democratic nation, the people in China were beating down Shanghai's door. They were saying, we want some of that. And the rest, as I say, is history. Shanghai and China went on a reform path. They're still halfway there only. They're halfway socialist, but they went so much towards the free market, and with their excellent education, the result is that you have the biggest single creation of wealth that one country has ever achieved in such a short period of time, per capita. What I want to say to you is this: the only way that that will happen is if people experience the change. So I'm hoping that we get either a DA in. It looks slimmer and slimmer, I hope, at the moment, but we have Mr. Ramaphosa there, and I think Mr. Ramaphosa is A, ambitious enough, and B, cold-bloodedly pragmatic enough to say, I might as well try this, because heaven knows I want to make it work. Trust me, he wants to make it work. He will do what he thinks is necessary. I don't think he's an ideologue. That's my own assessment.
I must say, I was very surprised by your answer, and I think your China example is a fantastic idea. And if one can get that on the table, so that there's small experimental zones.
Yeah. Go and read the last chapter. But you first have to read all the others to see how we get to that. But I'm a firm believer. I think, for example, racism. Racism, I think, in South Africa is the result of this chasm of privilege and poverty. White privilege is a thing, trust me. And black underprivilege is a thing. It's real. And it will never disappear unless we afford people the opportunity, the freedom to develop. And as you say, not by pulling down, because then we're all equally poor. Joe.
How did Margaret Thatcher deal with the trade union? What mechanism did she use to baseball bats?
She did what few people, let alone few men, would have been able to do. And so that she had. What is the industrial expression for those round objects? That's what she had. She had bearings. She had a bearing. She had a tough bearing. She's, she really took them. She froze them out in the winter of discontent by simply going to the brink, not conceding, and people were almost, it was bloody, it was awful. And then she started changing the law. Some of them she started by stealth. The laws protecting trade unions and aiding trade unions to gather more members, for example. Compulsory trade union fees, secret ballots, that sort of thing she brought in. She did all sorts of changes that would benefit us enormously. But the most important thing is, I think, is that winter of discontent when she stared down the coal miners. And it just never changed. I mean, they never looked back after that. So it's a difficult thing. It's going to be a bloody war. But I think it can come from the inside. If you can show, because she didn't do that. She didn't have pockets of demonstration where she experimented with freedom, which I think is the way to go. Because if it comes from the inside, and what can be more reasonable to say to the unions, it's just this geographical area, we're going to try it in Kuga or in Nababib or in Cape Town, or as a friend of mine suggested, Mpiake Labini, whom Martin knows, why not Soweto? Why not Alexandra? Make that a free market zone. Can you imagine how quickly this country will turn around if people start seeing shopping malls and I mean real progress going and jobs being created more so than in the rest of South Africa?
But we do have that. We are working in that industry, and we have been working on that for the last 3 years.
We have?
We're working on more industrial commercialization
Yes.
of Soweto and Alexandra.
Yes.
So maybe we are going that way.
I think so, but what I'm saying is take the labour laws out, take the taxes out or lower them to a flat tax, make it really easy for people to do business, cheap, in Soweto.
Could you be more specific? You said on a couple of occasions staring down the coal miners. What specifically did she do to break the
There was a
unions?
negotiation and a strike, as far as I recall, and she and the workers were effectively locked out of the workplace and got no income. Billy Elliot, who's seen Billy Elliot? That process that takes place in the Billy Elliot movie, and then people wanted to break ranks, and then they got beaten up by the strikers, and so it went on, and they just. I mean, it was not a nice thing to see. They broke the back of the morale when people become invested in the system. You see, the problem is if you have a system where it's okay to strike and you get benefits, then people invest emotionally. And when that expectation is shattered, it is not a nice thing to see. But I don't think there's an easy answer. I think we're going to have huge pain.
If I might just say something there. When I was a child during that, I grew up during the Margaret Thatcher destroying the unions. We had a 3-day week,
Yes.
which we loved as children because we went to school only 3 days a week, so we got holidays. But it was very, very painful. Families were broken, lives were broken. It was hugely hard, huge amount of pain. The country has not possibly quite recovered from that in terms of relationships, but it worked.
That's the problem. It's and what you should also add is that in the 60s and 70s, Britain and the post-war era set foot on this path of socializing everything, social health care, social everything, and the state spending went up and up and up, and the inflation went up, and the state debt went up. So they were in a terrible way.
And some of those areas have not quite recovered, the human relationships have not quite recovered, particularly between the police and a lot of the
You can imagine that. I mean, it's like my grandparents who came from the Anglo-Boer War. They blamed the English for at least a generation or longer. And you know what corrected that? Is when my people became prosperous. All the other problems disappeared. We even like the English.
Any more questions?
So I mean, to what extent is, when you talk about trade union density, is that caused by the trade unions being politically very close to government?
Well,
And,
sorry.
socialist countries, and in South Africa now, COSATU and others seem to want to break with the ANC. I don't know if that's going to happen with Cyril Ramaphosa because they're backing him. But if the trade unions are not part of the political
yes.
governing party, to what extent does that allow this sort of deregulation of things to happen?
Yes, maybe so, because you are aware, I think it's implied by your question, is that the COSATU has been an ally and a part of the voting machine, the election machine. They rallied the votes. They did more work probably than the ANC members who are non-union and officials. So they're very important, and also there is this marriage in the public service, where, as I say, 70% of public servants belong to COSATU. But it's a love-hate relationship, because the government now finds itself on the employer side, so it's not always easy. But the way they've dealt with it is really not to push back too hard over the years. Where they fell out of bed is with corruption. So you may be right that there could be room, but then there's always the looming possibility of a breakaway to the left. So the unions may go on their own, or they may join ranks with the EFF or something similar. And then it's going to be very, very interesting and very turbulent.
But then they don't control the government to the extent that they do at the moment.
They do, unfortunately, to some extent.
There was a question at the back here. This gentleman, you're welcome.
So if you are ultimately positive, you seem so on Cyril Ramaphosa by saying that he's pragmatic and not an ideologue.
Yeah.
How soon after he tries a CODESA do you think he will take the steps in your direction? What are you proposing?
I'm trying to get an appointment. I phoned last week. Still waiting. No, look, it's a really. I don't know what's going on in his head. He's a very secretive man. I've just read the Ray Hartley book on Ramaphosa, and he's you look in vain for what he thinks about policy. He doesn't show his hand. What he says on the stage, I don't think you must take too much note of that. This thing about, I know Martin gets very upset about the nationalisation issue. I honestly think it's politicking. He knows it's not going to work. The Constitutional Court will stop it, or something will stop it. But it's good politics at this stage, because he's still trying to consolidate his position. Was very precarious at some stage, and it's still not quite there. But I think we've turned the corner in terms of at least getting. But it's no use having a nice president. We want one who starts taking the knife. So I think some of the things you might start seeing. I don't think he's painfully aware of the budget. He might start cutting back. But what does he do about welfare spending? You know, we have more welfare recipients than employees, by far. I mean, what countries have that? What other country has more people on the dole holding out the hand than workers? Is he going to have the courage? I don't know.
We'll get them working.
Get them working.
I'm the next. Yes, my question would be if trade unions are so bad for employment and workers, why are workers joining them? I mean, there's a reason that they come up with
because workers join them once they're inside. That's how it works. You don't join a trade union and then go and look for work. You join a trade union once you have work. So already the cadre of workers who join trade unions are the privileged elite, if you like, amongst workers. They are the more talented people with better education, more productivity and so on. So they are able to hold down a job even in this climate where the minimum wages are high and the bargaining councils hold sway and so on.
But what makes you also aiming for is trade unions down in the news when there is a strike usually, but they also have certain other functions in a large company. It's not only that they are about the wages and striking. I think there's other functions that they also
they have other functions.
That one. And I think that needs also to be addressed. And I don't think you can throw out the trade unions just like.
I'm just telling you what the figures show. It's bad news. It's bad news. And bear in mind how it's set up. The trade unions are a product of the Labour Relations Act. But for the Labour Relations Act, you would almost have almost no trade unions. And the job of the trade unions, their directive under the Act, effectively, is to enforce the labour laws by taking employers to the CCMA and to the Labour Court, by calling strikes, by doing all of those things. And we know how it's played out in South Africa. So you can say they have other functions. They should help with training. Can you really give me an example where a trade union has made a major contribution?
The point that I'm making is trade unions, okay, that's a European thing. I'm now going back into the history of trade unions is that they actually on the micro level, they assisted with, how can I say, they assisted with disputes between employer and or management and lower ranking employers. Wage labor against management type of.
One thing you should understand is that there's of course nothing that prevents a worker from joining a trade union, even in a free market. I don't say you should have a ban on trade unions. I'm simply saying people should be free to associate with a trade union or not to associate, and don't give them artificial support. So I have absolutely no doubt that unions have benefits for workers, and well-run unions have more benefits for workers. We looked at the finance industry. I used to act for SASBO, which was the union in the finance industry. My goodness, you have not met a less militant group of guys in your life. They like, you know, when you go to the bank and you see that official that fills in the forms. Those guys, they SASBO. And they're quite serious about making a contribution. But unfortunately, that's not where the problems are. Not in finance.
I think there was a question over here. Then I think we've had our final question. Yes?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Frans, thank you very much. Thank you to the audience.
Thank you.